We're up to the Mishnah on Daf Nun Vav Amid Aleph. So the Mishnah, today's Mishnayos deal with a lot of the things we've already dealt with, but instead of animals, we're talking about chickens. Now we're talking about chickens. So a lot of the halachas are the same because the Mishnah just speaks out, although chickens have slightly different anatomy, the same puncture in the esophagus creates a treifa by a chicken. So the Mishnah says, Elu treifas ba'oif. These are the following treifas by a chicken, by a bird. Nukuvas aveshet, if the esophagus is punctured like a cow. Psukas agageres, if the trachea is severed most of the way. Hikta chulda al roisha. It's interesting. Instead of just saying a puncture to the brain, to the skull, it says if a weasel bit the chicken's head. Apparently that was a major problem. So that you see a weasel bite the chicken's head. So if it bit it on the top of the head, where the teeth could puncture the skull and the brain, then it's a treifa. Now the Gemara is going to point out, this is a little bit kind of grosser, but it's not automatically a treifa. There's a way to test if the brain is punctured, as we'll see. There's a way to test it. There's a concern. When the weasel bites it on the top of the head, there is a concern the weasel's teeth punctured the brain, but there's a way to test it. It's not an automatic treifa. It's a problem. Says the Mishnah Vayter, Nikav HaKargavon, the gizzard. The stomach has, the chicken has basically three parts of its stomach. The esophagus, the food goes straight into the crop. The esophagus goes into the crop. The crop goes into the kurkavon, which is the gizzard, and the gizzard goes into the intestines. So if the gizzard, the second part of the stomach, is punctured, that's a problem. Nikfu hadakin, or if the intestines were stomach, that's also a treifa. Nafal la'ar, if it fell into the fire. Apparently chickens falling into fire while it's alive was a problem. It happens. So how do you know if the chicken comes out? And the chicken's like, whoa. So how do you know what's going on inside? So here's the halacha. If some of the organs became scorched, im yerukin, if they turned green, then psulim. The Gemara is going to clarify, most of the organs inside the animal, inside the chicken, are red. Heart, liver, kidneys, right? They're all red. If they turn green, that's a problem. Obviously, by the opposite, is if you have the intestines are green. So if they turn red, that's going to be an issue. So the area, the parts of the stomach that are meant to be green, if they turn red, it's puzzle. If they're red and they turn green, then it's a treifa. Zak the Mishnah. The Mishnah then says the last halacha. We had a drusa, which is if you knock over an animal and it fell 10 tvachim, so you have to wait 24 hours to see if it survived. By a chicken, it takes a lot less contact to make it a drusa because they're tiny. So darsa v'tarfa b'kaisel. If you kick a chicken against the wall, which you shouldn't do. Or if an animal knocks it over. So here's the halacha. If it gets up and flutters, and and you wait 24 hours, meaning in other words, if it shows that it has vitality and it waits 24 hours, you're fine. Okay. So what we're going to talk about is the first part, which is that if a weasel bites the top of the head of the chicken, so the Mishnah said it's a problem because there's a chance that the brain was punctured. So it says the Gemara, Rav Shmuel v'Levi Damru, Rav Shmuel and Levi all say it's not an automatic treifa. You have to make sure. You have to test. Kind of gross, because this is about to be gross. You have to test to see if the brain is punctured. And here's the test: you put your finger in the chicken's mouth and you push up. If things come out, then it's a treifa, and if nothing comes out, then you're good to go. I assume do this after the animal's dead. I have to assume do this after the animal's dead, because you know what? Sometimes chicken's not worth it. Do you know what I mean? But the point is, I think you do this after. It would be terrible time to do this when the animal's alive. The point is, you put the finger in the mouth, push up on the top of the mouth, the palate, and if stuff comes out of the brain, then obviously it's punctured. If nothing comes out of the brain, then you're good to go. Zak the Mishnah, Zak the Gemara, Machlis yadol v'numu baidik. Im mevatzveitz v'oileh. If something comes out, then it's a treifa, because that means that there was a puncture. Vim lav kshera. Now the Gemara has an interesting point. If you remember, when it comes to, let's say, the skull, there's two membranes. There's the lower membrane and the upper membrane. So I don't know if you remember, we had by the lungs, but we had a similar shiloh by the brain. Is a puncture of the top one alone a treifa, or does it have to puncture through and through? So it says the Gemara, I understand if you believe that both have to be punctured, I guess how this test is effective. Because if both have to be punctured, then if stuff comes out. But if you hold that merely puncturing the outside one is a treifa, then how is the test effective? You're going to put your finger in, push up, nothing's going to come out. But you're going to think, oh, that means there's no puncture. But there might have been the outside one might have been punctured. So says the Gemara, if you believe that the outer membrane being punctured is a treifa, even if the inner membrane is not, so then maybe it's not an effective test, because you'll push up, nothing will come out, and you'll think there's no puncture, but there was a puncture on the outer membrane. Says the Gemara, Nichosh, you should be concerned, Dilma ilo inkiv, maybe the outer membrane was taka punctured, tata lo inkiv, and nothing's coming out, not because it's not a treifa, but because the lower membrane is not punctured. So the Gemara says it's not true. The Metzias is that if one of the membranes are punctured and you push up, stuff will come out. The pressure of pushing up will puncture the other membrane. So if even one of the membranes is punctured, it's an effective test. Nothing's going to come out if both are intact. If one of them's punctured, the pressure of your finger will puncture the other one as well. Says the Gemara, okay, so far we've gone with the Shita of Rav. It will cause things to come out if merely one of the membranes are punctured. The pressure will puncture the other one. So the point is, it doesn't matter. If you believe that there's a treifa by one of the membranes being punctured, it will cause it. You're right. If you hold that it's not a treifa by only one, then it's not a clearly effective test, because it'll cause more. You'll have to throw out more chickens than you have to. I'd say it's more machmer. Now, this is going with the presumption that there's a way to test it if there's a puncture in the top. Rabbi Levi Shmuel says you push up. Says the Gemara, Amar Ziri, Ein Badika L'Cholda. But Ziri says there's no test. Because the teeth of a weasel are very thin. What that means, we'll have to clarify. But he says there's no test, because the teeth are very thin. So the Gemara says, in other words, according to Ziri, if the weasel bites the head of the chicken, you have to throw the chicken out. There's no test. So says the Gemara, I understand. There's no test because the teeth are thin. Who cares if the teeth are thin? So they'll make thin holes. They'll make holes though. Says the Gemara, teeth are curved. So it's possible they're puncturing the membranes at different spots. Meaning they might be making like that hole. So in other words, the stuff may not come out because the lower membrane and the upper membrane may not be punctured on the same spot because the teeth are curved. That's what he meant. Itaka will puncture both, but it's not an effective test because the holes might not be lined up because the teeth of the weasel are sometimes curved. Okay. Says the Gemara, Kisalik. Now, so Zeiri says there's no way to test it. Says the Gemara, he retracted his view. Kisalik Narda Shalchu. When Zeiri went up from Bavel to Nardoi, he sent the following message. That which I said before, you can't test it, is a mistake. I take it back. Because I just heard in the name of Rish Lakish, you're able to test it with your finger by pushing up. So I retract my view. But Rish Lakish did say, you can't test it with a nail. What does that mean? They're concerned, think of the top of my cup as the top of the brain of a little chicken. The concern is that it was punctured. So the way to test it is to put the finger in and push. There's another way potentially. You take off the skull, and you're looking at the membrane, and just take a nail, like a nail from a hammer, and just scrape over the top and see if it gets snagged. If it gets snagged, that means there's a hole. If it's smooth, then there's no hole. Says the Gemara, don't do that test. That is not an effective test. Why? As we'll see in a moment, the nail will probably cause more punctures than nails are sharp. So when you're trying to drag it over, it might cause more punctures, and then you'll just be trafing up potentially non-trafe chickens. Yeah, but you won't be able to know when the puncture happens. All of a sudden you'll be like, there's so many punctures here, and not realizing you're creating the punctures with your puncture test. Says the Gemara, Rav Yechon says, no, you could test it with a nail. Take a nail, run it over the membrane. If it's smooth, good, and if it gets snagged on something, it's a treifa. Plukta, this machlekes of whether you could use a nail to test the membrane to see if there's a hole. This machlekes, Rav Yechon Shlakish is another machlekes. Rav Yehuda, Rav Nechemia, chad badik biyada v'chad badik b'machate. One Tana checked with his finger by pushing up. The other Tana used a needle. Scrape the needle over the top to see if it's snagged. The Gemara says like this. Now, by the way, each one has a maila and each one has a chesaron. The maila of the maila of the nail is that it's a very fine test. like nothing's going to get past it because your mamish going over a little spot. You'll catch every little thing. The chisaron is you might cause more punctures and you might trafe up kosher chickens. The maila of the palate test with the finger is that you won't do that. The chisaron is you might miss a treifa. So each one has a maila, each one has a chisaron. So you have these tanoim that are using different methods. Man debadik biyada, a tana who used the finger method, amar leila man debadik b'mechate. He said to his Tana friend who was using the nail method, how much money of Klal Yisrael are you wasting? Meaning, you're throwing out chickens left and right that are actually kosher, but you're trafing them up with your test. So you're wasting Klal Yisrael's money. So he responded, he says, and how many nevelos are you feeding Klal Yisrael? Because at least you're right, I'm throwing out kosher chickens, but every chicken that gets past me is 100% kosher. Your test is not foolproof, and therefore you're potentially serving nevelos to Klal Yisrael. The Gemara just clarifies, but it's not nevela, it's actually a treifa. It's just like a terminology. The Gemara says, nevelos hashchuti ela treifa shemanikar krim shalach. Okay, treifa. You understand what he meant. Meaning he's saying, so yeah, I'm maybe at fault for maybe wasting Jewish money, but you're at fault by potentially feeding them treifas. So which ones? It's like which ones? They once asked Rabbi, like a girl's wearing tight mini skirts or tight pants. So he said, which is better? And he said, which is worse? So that was it. And then he got into the shiloh. So he's like, there's no better, which is worse? So they both, one decided it's worse to serve treifas, the other decided it's worse to waste Klal Yisrael's money. Okay, Zak the Gemara. So we had two Atanoim. One used the finger method and one used the needle method. One was Rav Yehuda, one was Rav Nechemia. Tistiyim, we have proof to Rav Yehuda, Huda Badik Biyada. It was Rav Yehuda who had used the finger method. Titania, Rav Yeshim ben Elazar, Mishum Rav Yehuda. Rav Yehuda once said, you're able to test with the finger method, but not with the nail method. Okay, meaning, so when you're testing to see if the membrane on top is punctured, use the finger method and not use the nail. End of discussion. It's clear as day that Rav Yehuda is the one who used the finger method and not the nail method. Great. Now, here's the one problem though. After Rav Yehuda said you should test it, and again, the purpose of the test is to see if the brain matter, if the membrane of the skull was punctured. Then Rav Yehuda said the following: Nishbar ha'etzem. If the skull is fractured, even if the membrane is intact, it's a treifa. Now that makes no sense. His whole point of testing the method is to see if the membrane is intact. If it's intact, it's kosher. If it's punctured, it's a problem. But then he said, if the skull is cracked, it's treif. Don't even bother. If there's a fracture in the skull, it's treif. It doesn't matter whether the membrane is intact, the membrane is punctured, it's treif. I don't understand. Is the membrane intact a way to save it, or is it a problem? At first he's saying test it. Test it for what? Test it to see if the membrane is intact, then it's good. If the membrane is punctured, it's a problem. But then he said, if there's a fracture in the skull, it's treif anyway. Which one is it? So it says the Gemara, Hagufa Kasha, it's a contradiction. You first got finished saying that you're supposed to check. You're checking for what? You're checking to say the membrane is intact. So if the membrane is intact, it's kosher. But then you just got finished teaching. Then you said that if there's a fracture in the skull, it's treif anyway. And we don't care about the membrane. So is the membrane being intact enough to save the animal or not? Let's see with the kusa. So the Gemara says they're not talking about the same type of bird. I don't know what this means, but a marine fowl. Oif shalmayim. What is that? A pelican? A kosher pelican. A kosher pelican. Apparently, obviously not. Marine fowl. I don't know, whatever kosher marine fowl. A duck? Oh, a duck. I like to think of ducks as small pelicans, but anyway, so the Kitzer, the Gemara says they're not talking about the same types of birds. Chickens apparently have a membrane on top of this, beneath the skull, between the skull and the brain. So for them, checking is effective. Then when he said that if there's a fracture in the skull, it's treif anyway, it's talking about marine fowl that don't have a membrane. So says the Gemara, what do you mean they don't have a membrane? Every animal has a membrane between the skull and the brain. So the Gemara says, they have a very fragile membrane. Apparently ducks' membranes around their skull, or beneath their skull, is thinner than chickens. So by chickens, you could effectively test it, but by ducks, you can't. Once there's a fracture, that's it. So not all birds are made the same. Okay. The Gemara now is going to speak it out, the same thing twice. So we'll run through this quickly. Shmuel used the finger method to check if the membrane was intact. Rav Huna as well. I hatani levi trepe shamanu chacham behema kneged ba'oif. Yesel and oif nishbar etzem af bishul nikav krum shalmayach. But didn't Levi teach that there's a chumrah that birds have over animals, and that if birds have a fracture in the skull, it's treif anyway, it doesn't care about the membrane. So is there a purpose in testing to see if the membrane is intact or not? So the Gemara answers the same answer before. That when it said that if there's a fracture in the skull, it's treif automatically, he's talking about marine birds, marine fowl that don't have a membrane. Says the Gemara, what do you mean they don't have a membrane? Every animal has a membrane between the skull and the brain. They have a very fragile membrane, and therefore there's no purpose in testing. The Gemara repeats itself. Again, there was a certain chicken that was shechted by Rav Chana. They brought to Rav Masna for a ruling. The case was that its skull was fractured, but the brain membrane was intact. And he says it's kosher because the membrane is intact. Wait a minute. But didn't Levi say that if the fracture of the skull it's treif automatically, there's no purpose in testing? That's talking about marine fowl that don't have a membrane. Says the Gemara, what do you mean they don't have a membrane? Every animal has a membrane. It means they have a more fragile, softer membrane, and therefore there's no purpose in testing. Okay, weiter. Rav Shizbi Badek B'Shimsha, different types of methods to test the membrane. We've seen the finger method of pushing up. We've also talked about the nail. Rav Shizbi would just check by the sun. He would look very close to see if there was any holes. Rav Yemar Badek B'Maya, Rav Yemar would fill it with water. What he would do is he would basically invert the chicken, fill it with water, fill the skull matter with water, and see if anything comes out. I don't know. Shouldn't have done that. Says the Gemara, okay. And Rav Acha Bar Yaakov Badek, or the next page, Begil Dechitma. He would use the stalk of wheat. He would scrape it on top to see if it's snagged. Rav Shizbi, Havi Avzi Didan Ka'ayv Shalmayim Dami. Rav Shizbi then said, geese are like marine fowl, that their membrane is too thin, you can't test it. Okay. The Mishnah then said that if a chicken falls into the fire, you basically take it out of the fire, and if the innards turn green, that means that it's a problem. Says the Gemara, Rav Yossi ben Yeshua, how much green has to show up? Is there a spot of green? Does it have to be 5 inches? Could it be a speck? Well, how much green has to show up in the let's say the heart or whatever, the lungs, for it to be a problem? So he says, Shir Yirikusan Kashir Nikavusan. The amount of green that will indicate a problem is like a hole. The same way any puncture in the lungs is treif, any amount of green after being in a fire is enough to treif it up. Manikuvusan b'mashu after Yirikusan b'mashu. Okay, here's the shaila. What if the green is by the next to the intestines? Now, let's say the Gemara, it's by the end of the liver. There's a spot of green. No. It's opposite the liver, but it's a spot of green where it should not be green. Here's the issue, though. You'll say, well, we said a spot of green is a problem. But you don't even need a liver. You could remove half the liver, it's still kosher. So is the spot of green worse than as if that part of the body was missing? So it says the Gemara, if the liver turned green in a spot next to the intestines, so is that a problem? So Amalei Treifik says, yeah, it's a problem. Says the Gemara, how could it be worse than if the liver is missing? So the Gemara says, I'll tell you why. It is worse. A spot of green indicates, after being in the fire, indicates that there's internal issues entirely everywhere. The spot of green is not a siba. It's not a siba, it's a siman. It's not the spot of the green that's the problem. It's what it indicates. And therefore, it's like a smoke alarm. It indicates there's major issues. So even if it's in a part of the internal organs, that if they were removed, it would still be kosher, it's still a problem. Because the green indicates major problems in this chicken. Because if there's a spot of green anywhere inside, that means the entire intestines are affected. Okay, Rav Yeshua ben Levi Rav Yeshua ben Levi had a chicken that fell in fire. Shajal Kamid Rav Elazar Hakfar B'Rebbe. He sends it to Rav Elazar Hakfar B'Rebbe. And Amar LeYerukin Hava. He said the intestines are green, v'achshrei, and they're kosher. So let me just explain outside what we're going to do. I sort of said this when we did the Mishnah. It depends what the color was supposed to be. If the color was supposed to be red and now it's green, it's a problem. If the color was supposed to be green and now it's red, it's a problem. If the color was supposed to be red and it's red, it's fine. If the color was supposed to be green and it's green, it's fine. It's just a matter of whether the color is what it was supposed to be. So they showed him the intestines. He said it's green, it's fine. So I said, what do you mean? Hatznan Yerukim Psul? I thought green is bad after a fire. He says, Lo Yamri Yerukim Psulim, but Kurkum and Kavit. Yeah, it's bad when it's supposed to be red. You know, if it's the gizzards, the heart, or the liver that are supposed to be red, and they're green, then it's a problem. The intestines are supposed to be green. If you pull out intestines, they're like a greenish, brownish. That's what they're supposed to be. This is the proper color. The Gemara speaks out, the similar Brisa says, Be'elu b'nei mayim amru, be'kurkaman b'lei v'kavid. When we said it turns green from the fire, it's a problem that's talking about the gizzard, the heart, and the liver, which are normally red. Rav Yitzchak bar Yosef havelehu tarnagula. Rav Yitzchak bar Yosef had a chicken that was, again, in the fire, they shechted it. They sent to Rav Avo, Adumin have it. He says, they're red, v'treifin, it's a problem. Says the Gemara, V'anan adumin ksherim. I thought green is the problem. You're saying red's the problem. Same answer. Amarle adumin shehariku v'yarikin shehdimu treifa. Le'amradulin ksherin u'belei v'kurkim v'kavit. He says it depends what the color is supposed to be. The case was, it was the intestines that turned red. The intestines are normally green, and now they're red, that's the problem. So it's the same rule. If it's the color it's supposed to be, then it's fine. If it's a different color than it's supposed to be, then it's an issue. Amar Rav Shmuel bar Chia, Amar Rav Mani, Adumin sheheriku. If let's say you have an organ that's normally red, and now it's green, so that's a problem. But, visholkun, but you boil them v'chazur v'hedimu. They go back to being red, ksherin. So in other words, if I have, let's say, the intestines, I have a heart. It's supposed to be red. Turns out it's green because it was in the fire. It's a problem. If you boil it, it goes back to being red, you're good to go. Why? Because apparently that's not a sign of being scorched. That means that it absorbs smoke. And therefore, if it just goes back, in other words, if boiling it goes back to the original color, then you're fine. By the way, I'll just say this outside, see it inside. The opposite is also true. If it's the good color, according to many Amoraim, but then if you boil it, it goes to the wrong color, that's also a problem. And that's why those Amoraim would say, you have to boil it first, because you don't actually know what the color is based on inspection, because the boiling might change it. So says the Gemara, if it was potentially. Oh, interesting. Good question. I don't know. So over here, it was supposed to be red, it was green, so it's no good. But then you boiled it, and it went back to red, you're good to go. Says the Gemara, why? My time up, because the fact that it went back to red indicates that there was nothing wrong with it. It was green before. Kutra ayil bahu. It must have just absorbed smoke. So he's being lenient that it was the wrong color, but then you boil it, goes back to the right color, you're good to go. Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak says, I'm going to be machmer this way also. Let's say you have an organ that's supposed to be red, and it is red. But then when you boil it, it turns green. That indicates that it was always a problem. So boiling can fix, but boiling can also destroy. And he says, "My taima igloi b'chayuse." That just reveals what it always was. So Rabbi Nachman bar Yitzchak is being machmer. So the question is, how do you do this? If boiling can change the status, so how do you ever eat it? The answer is you have to boil it. If it was already in fire, you have to boil all the internal organs before you eat it. You have to boil it first, because boiling really reveals the essence. Says the Gemara, it's not true. I'll tell you why. Let's say Gavin has a chicken. Chicken fell in the fire. He looks at the heart, and the heart is red. Good. According to Rav Ashi, no good. You got to boil it. Because what if after boiling it turns green? Says the Gemara Loihi, no, that's not the psak. We don't look for problems. If right now it's red, that means that it's kosher. Boiling can fix. True. And maybe boiling also can destroy. But you don't have to look for it. If it's right now red and it's kosher, you're right, boiling can turn it green. You don't have to do that. Loihi. We don't look for problems in halacha. If you boil it and it turns green, then I'll deal with it. But I'm not going to tell you to boil it to potentially reveal problems. It's not how halacha works. Okay, the last halacha of this Mishnah was that if the chicken got banged against the wall, you have to wait 24 hours. Says the Gemara, even after waiting 24 hours, and after the chicken showing vitality, you still have to do internal badika, meaning you have to wait 24 hours, To show vitality, shecht it, and then you have to do bedika. You have to look in the livers, you have to look in the heart, you have to make sure there's nothing ruptured inside the chicken. Meaning, don't think that just the shechita alone is kosher, you have to actually do an internal inspection as well. Let's just finish up, we'll do this Mishnah, a little bit weiter. So we've mentioned things that are treif. Now we're going to mention things that are kosher. Basically, most of the things we know already, they're similar to the previous Mishnah, but they're just not as severe. Elu ksheris ba'oif. These are the following ailments that are not a treifa by a chicken. Nikva hagargeres. If the trachea was punctured or split down its length vertically. Right? Trachea is only a problem if it's cut horizontally by roiv. If it's punctured or slit down the lengthwise, then it's fine. Or hikta chulda roisha makom she'ein oisa isa treifa. Or if the weasel bit on its head, but an area not near the skull, so a weasel, let's say, banged into its head, or bit it in an area that would not cause a puncture. Or nikif hazefek. Or if the crop was punctured. By the way, this is interesting, because if the esophagus is punctured, it's treif. The esophagus turns into the crop. If it punctures the crop, it's fine. So esophagus, no good. Esophagus turns into the crop, and it punctures the crop, it's fine. So just, you have to know where the esophagus ends and the crop begins. Rabbi Oimer, afilu nittel. Rabbi says, even if the crop was removed, it's kosher. Rabbi is mechadish, that not just if the crop is punctured, but even if the crop is removed, it's kosher as well. Yatsu b'nei mayim v'lei nikfu. If the intestines spilled out, but they were not punctured, so the chicken gets cut in the stomach and the belly comes out. Nothing punctured, that's kosher. Nishtabru gafel, if its wings are broken, nishtabru ragleho, or its legs are broken, nimru to karfel, or if it loses its feathers, all these are kosher. Rav Yehuda says if the feathers are removed, it's puzzle. Broken wings is kosher. And broken legs. Yeah, but you have to know exactly what part of the legs. Okay, Zak the Gemara. So, I didn't think so. I thought so also, but I don't know. Okay, let's just do this last part of the Gemara. The Mishnah had said that if the crop is punctured, it's kosher, and then Rebbe was mechadish, even if the crop was removed. Says the Gemara the following story, and you'll see instantly there's a very strange thing about the story. Tan Rabbanan, Ma'aseh Rav Simoy Rav Tzadik. Rav Simoy Rav Tzadik went, Halchul Abishana Belud. They went to make a leap year in Lud. B'shavsu ba'oinoi. They stayed in the city called Oinoi. And they had a shaila, this is their psak. Hoiru b'tarpachas kirebi bezefek. They paskined regarding the uterus like Rebbe and the crop. Okay, so Rebbe said by a crop that if the crop is removed, it's kosher. They paskin like a uterus like Rebbe of the crop. What's the case exactly? I don't know. They paskin like a uterus like Rebbe at the crop. So there's two options. Either it means the case was the uterus was missing, and they said the same way Rebbe said that if the crop is missing, uterus missing, also kosher. So the case was one case and that a uterus only. Or, two things. They paskin like the uterus that if it's missing, it's kosher. And they paskin like Rebbe that if the crop is missing, it's also kosher. So the question, what exactly are the words missing? Well, the Gemara says, Ibaylahu, Hayru b'tar pachas li'isura kerebi, b'zefek lehatera. Did they paskin? Is it two things, two statements. They paskin like the uterus, that if a uterus is missing, it's a problem. But they paskin like Rebbe by the crop. So that's option number one, is that there are two different cases. There's uterus and crop. Uterus, they're machmer, and crop, they're lenient. Dilma, or perhaps, hoiru petarpachas leheterik Rebbe bezefek. Or really, it's just one case of uterus. Uterus of a chicken was missing, and they were saying it's kosher, just like Rebbe paskins that if a zefek is missing, so to the uterus is missing as well. So what was their psak exactly? But they never addressed the case of a zefek. They were just talking about a uterus only. Teiku, unclear. Amar Rabba vitim Rabbi Shimon Levi. Gaga shel zefek nida kiveshet. Heicha amra bibi arbaya kol shenimtach imay. I mentioned this before by the Mishnah. If an esophagus is punctured, it's treif. The esophagus goes into the zefek. The esophagus is punctured, it's kosher. So when does it stop being an esophagus and become a zefek? So the Gemara says when it tapers off. In other words, gaga shel zefek nida kiveshet. If you look at the crop, it's basically it's like a ball. It's like circular. The esophagus goes in, but the esophagus has like a little bit of a right angle where they connect. The right angle is still the esophagus. If there's a puncture at the right angle, it's treif. It's dafka in the bowl of the crop, where this first stomach, where if there's a puncture, it's kosher. Just to finish up, the Mishnah had said if the belly comes out of the chicken but there's no puncture, it's fine because it could survive that way. Says the Gemara Chiddush, one with this, Amar Rabbi Shmuel bar Rabbi Yitzchak. Lo yishanu al shlei hibich behen. It's only true if when you put the chicken's intestines in, you put it in the proper way. Aval hibich behen. But let's say when you put it back, you put it upside down. Treifa. If you put back the belly of the chicken into the chicken, the intestines of the chicken, but you don't put it exactly the way Hashem wanted, it'll die. What's the chiddush? The chsiv hu ascha ve'yichaynaneka. The pasuk says that Hashem is a builder. What does that mean? Shabara kadosh baruch hu kaynaniyus be'adam. Hashem made levels in a person that the stomach has to lie exactly the way Hashem wanted it, and if you invert it, can't survive. The Gemara similarly, Tanya Haramer Omer hu ascha ve'yichaynaneka karacha dekulabe. Hashem made a person like a city. There's different components. Everything is included, and it's like an organism, but it has to run properly. Meaning, mimenu kehanav, mimenu neviyav, mimenu sanav, mimenu malachav. Just like a city has its leaders, it's got its simpleton, it's got its workers. Every part of the body has its different functionality. Mimenu pina, mimenu yated. But if you mix it up, then it's a problem. Just to finish up a maisa. So by the way, if the stomach of a person ever comes out, it's very, very dangerous to put it back in. You have to put it back in. But you better put it back in the way Hashem wanted it. So the Gemara has the following story one with this. There was a certain Armenian who saw a certain person, he fell from the roof to the ground, and his belly split open and intestines were out of his body. So this is how he put it back in. He brought the victim's son, and he pretended to slaughter the son using magic, meaning using sleight of hand, he basically made it look like he killed his son. And what this father lying there, he was like, oh, come on. So basically the father groaned and that retracted the belly naturally, and then he sewed him up. The Gemara says, in Gid V'indach, the father groaned, was very upset that his son, from his perspective, was killed, even though nothing happened, it was all illusion. Oil Lamaneh, he drew his belly in naturally, and the Armenian sewed it up. All right, we'll stop now.